Hi, I'm Danny, also known as GCSE Potential, and today we're talking about how to get into Oxbridge for medicine. So I'm really lucky to be joined by Ojas, who is an Oxford medic. He's in his second year studying at the Queen's College, and he also is the founder of my UCAT. So Ojas, would you want to introduce yourself?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Danny, and it's great to be here today. So, like you said, I'm a second year med student at Queen's College, Oxford. At my UCAT, our social enterprise, we do a lot of work with medical admissions, Oxford and Cambridge as well, with brilliant success. There were 37 students actually this year selected for medicine at either University of Oxford or Cambridge. And so the main thing that I think I want to emphasize for today is that it is very much achievable. So I think for a lot of people, unless you're in an environment where you're seeing people all the time, getting into Oxford, getting into Cambridge, it might seem like something that's very unachievable, or that they're looking for people who have cured cancer, who play 100 different musical instruments, who speak 10 languages. But I can confirm kind of after seeing like this year who the 37 people were. They were all smart, they were all passionate about medicine, and none of them were anything like that. So there is no need to have cured any rare diseases. There is no need to be completely different to everyone else. Oxford and Cambridge students are very much normal people, just passionate about their subject. And I think the aim for today is definitely to make the process seem a lot more achievable and to hopefully inspire as many of you as possible to apply.
Brilliant. Let's get straight to it. So to begin with, we're going to go through this chronologically. So GCSEs, A-levels, UCAT, personal statement, and finally interview. So let's start off with GCSEs. What GCSE grades do you need for Oxbridge? Do they differ depending on university, etc.?
Brilliant, thank you. So for your GCSEs, clearly you want to be at the level of majority 7 to 9 to be starting to look at Oxford or Cambridge, is at least in the majority of cases. Now, Oxford publishes very clear data on their use of GCSEs. And what you find is that when shortlisting to interview, they put a 50% weighting on your GCSE grades. Now, 25% of that is down to the number of A-star grades you have at GCSE. Now, grade 8 and 9 are considered the same. And 25% of that is down to the proportion of grade 8 and 9 you have at GCSE. So I'm sure Danny can put up the graphs for that very soon. But effectively what those graphs will show you is that to have kind of a very strong chance of getting an interview, you ideally want to have at least 9 A-star, 8 A-star grades, and about 90% A-star grades at GCSE. So what you're looking for is kind of majority grade 8s or above, and that's for Oxford. Now at Cambridge, what you'll find is that the process is kind of not as centralized, and it's not the same algorithmic use of GCSEs. So while they will be looking for majority top grades, 7, 8s and 9s, that can be compensated for by other aspects, such as, for example, UCAT score, and they are on the whole interviewing a much greater proportion of applicants. In the range of 80 to 85% of applicants are being interviewed. And so, yes, you want to be aiming for majority 7, 8, 9. At Oxford specifically, you want to be working out your percentage and number of A-star grades, and ideally you have above 90%. Although this is contextualized to your school performance. So if you look at the graph and you see kind of people, small numbers of people getting interviews with maybe 7 A-star, 6 A-star, you can think about how that's going to be seen in the context of the school. For example, you're at a lower performing school, these requirements could be relaxed a little bit. And at Cambridge, what you'll find is that these algorithmic requirements are not there. So yes, you want to be aiming for high GCSEs.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then the next stage of the application process is A-levels. So how do they differ across universities? Which A-level grades do you need? What are the offers? What do they tend to be? 3 A-levels or 4 A-levels? The most important questions.
Really important questions. So I guess the first decision will be, how many and which ones do you do? So I guess the starting point is, what do the universities objectively require? Now, Oxford is kind of very transparent in that kind of chemistry is essential, and you then want one additional science subject. So that could be biology, that could be physics, that could be math. I would very strongly recommend that all students have both chemistry and biology, even though technically you can manage without it, and there are a small number of people who get in without it, because the interview process is so heavily focused on the sort of things that are covered in the human aspects of the biology course. So you definitely need chemistry and biology. Now, the third subject for Oxford is pretty much immaterial. It's sometimes found that students who have A-level maths might find the UCAT quantitative reasoning a bit easier, but not having maths is not a barrier for Oxford. So that's your 3, and your offer for Oxford is always going to be 1A star and 2As, and your predicted grade requirements are also 1A star and 2As. Now, there's no kind of particular advantage of getting more than that, being predicted 3A stars or getting 3A stars, because this is just used as a minimum requirement. And so your shortlisting is going to be based on UCAT plus GCSE and then interview. Now, 4 A-levels is one of the ways that you can show academic capability. And that is perhaps something that if someone is very borderline and is kind of narrowly on the cutoff of kind of UCAT plus GCSE, may be looked at. But 4 A-levels is certainly something that's not part of the main shortlisting process. And if your 4 A-levels distract you from the UCAT, that would be kind of a complete disaster. So on the whole, 4 A-levels is absolutely not necessary. Only something you do if you're interested in the 4th subject. The majority of Oxford students currently have 3 A-levels. And kind of myself, I took 4. I know others who took 4. They didn't find it helpful in any way. So do it if you enjoy it, do it if you think you're a comfortable 4A stars, but no need. Now, if we move on to Cambridge, slightly different in that at the majority of colleges, they do have either a harsh or an unofficial requirement for 3 science or math subjects. So the biology and chemistry is essential. You then want one of either physics or maths. Now, there are a small number of colleges that have relaxed those requirements, and I'm sure I can send the link for Danny to put up. But they do have some quite explicit stats to show that your chances of getting an offer are lower if you don't have your 3 science or math subjects. So I would strongly recommend for Cambridge having one of maths or physics, although for Oxford it's not so significant. And you'll find that as a result of that being the requirement, the Cambridge interviews at some colleges do incorporate a little bit more physics or maths into them, even though the majority will probably be human biology oriented. So that's kind of what you want. Now, predictions-wise, 2A stars and 1A kind of is going to be your minimum, the most likely offer as well. Some colleges can occasionally give 3A star offers too. In terms of doing 4 subjects, again, no significant advantage. Potentially, if you're borderline with the holistic assessment, can be one of the ways of showing academic potential, but there are so many others, like having good GCSEs, like having high UCAT, like doing supercurricular projects. So I would personally say it is not worth the time commitment. Your 4th A-level is by no means essential. And in fact, if you do apply with 4 A-levels, there is the potential that some colleges at Cambridge only will make you a 4 A-level offer, which then does make your life a bit trickier. So on the whole, kind of neither require 4, do only if you're interested. For Oxford, make sure you're getting A star AA predicted offer, including biology and chemistry. For Cambridge, aiming for A star A predicted an offer, including biology, chemistry, maths, or biology, chemistry, physics.
Very nice, thank you. So moving on from A-levels, you now reach the UCAT, which is a really important exam. It was previously the BMAT, but most universities now look at the UCAT. So kind of what UCAT scores do you need? We have a separate video talking about like how to get to medicine more generally, so more UCAT advice covered there, but kind of what scores do you need based on the university?
So if we start with University of Oxford, so as I just said, we've got Oxford putting a 50% weighting on your percentage and number of A-star grades, so 8s or 9s, and a 50% weighting on your UCAT score, and that's just your score out of 2,700, so not the SJT component. Now, we've got these two being weighted 50-50, and the kind of combined score being contextualized to your school performance. So it's not necessarily as straightforward as, say, something like Imperial, where they had a harsh cutoff last year of 3,020 around there, and slightly lower for a contextual student. So because it's this 50-50 basis, there is no kind of one specific score that is essential, but they do have very clear data from last year that you can see. And you can see that for the likelihood of you getting an interview to be reasonably high and to be kind of more high than to not get an interview, you want over 3,000. And so if in all terms out of 3,600, you wanted over 3,000, we can translate that into kind of current scores out of 2,700 as kind of somewhere in the 2,200s. 2,200, 2,250, that's the kind of range you want to be aiming for Oxford. And that's as a home student. And that will mean kind of your chances of interview, given that your GCSEs are high, are kind of very close to certain in that kind of range. Now, as an international student, the UCAT requirements can be a lot higher. The interview competition is very similar. UCAT requirements can be higher. And so in the past for Oxford, you wanted around 3,200. And so you can translate that down back into kind of your 2,700 requirements. And so you can imagine the average person out of this 3,200 may have had an 850 or so abstract reasoning score. And so you might be aiming for around 2,300 and something for your international scores. So for Oxford, aiming for 2,200s home student, 2,300s international student. Obviously, it's not a hard and fast boundary, and there are individuals with lower scores who are offered interviews, depending on contextual circumstances, and of course GCSEs. For Cambridge, the scoring is not quite as algorithmic. That would be the first take home. And secondly, it's done by the college, so the requirements can be slightly variable between colleges. And I guess finally, they are interviewing a much bigger proportion of students. So while at Oxford, most of the competition is before the interview, at Cambridge, a large proportion of the competition is at and after the interview. And so for Cambridge, the UCAT requirements can be lower. And so in the past, like this year, around 2,800, 2,900 was sufficient, with some people even getting interviews with less than that, although it can be variable by college. And so you can imagine kind of 2,900 translated down. I would really recommend looking at kind of equivalent percentiles. So if 2,940 was about a top 10% score in 2024, then this year you'd be aiming for around 2,100 and something to be in that range in 2025. So as a broad overview, Oxford, higher UCAT requirements does mean you have kind of less competition at interview. Cambridge, slightly lower UCAT requirements. In kind of your scoring system out of 2,700, you want to be aiming around 2,000, 2,100, that kind of range, but is a lot more holistic, are giving out a lot more interviews. And so you can compare that to Oxford, where kind of very UCAT GCSE heavy, and you might be looking for around 2,200 home, 2,300 international.
Beautiful. Okay, next step of the process then is personal statements. A lot of people kind of don't know what to put on a personal statement, or they overemphasize it. So kind of how much does personal statement matter with regard to Oxbridge?
Brilliant. So, I mean, I told you the Oxford process. You've got, at least for the majority of interview invites, so they do out of 425 interview invites at Oxford, the majority are done through this process, 50-50 UCAT GCSE. The 80 invites on the borderline, they can be more holistic, they can look at contextual factors, they can look at personal statement, other things. At that point, if you are very borderline, the personal statement could be of some significance. But besides that, pretty much not at all in deciding who gets an interview, at least for the majority of applicants. For Cambridge, again, quite similar. Maybe used somewhat as part of the holistic process, but the biggest focus is going to be, again, UCAT. So you can see that UCAT and GCSE matter more. Personal statement isn't deciding whether or not you get an interview, but it is still something to focus on. And reason being, your personal statement is very likely to be discussed at least at some part of your interview. So for some applicants, it can be kind of just the first 5 minutes of maybe one of their interviews. For others, it can be a slightly bigger part. And so some proportion of at least one of your Oxbridge interviews, you'd imagine the personal statement to come up, and perhaps for them to pick out maybe one of the scientific things you've mentioned there, and to expect you to maybe know about it a little bit off topic from your personal statement, have a bit more of a broader overview, react to some probing questions. So the main thing with personal statement is not that it's being scored, not that it's going to decide whether you get an interview, but that it's really, really important you talk about stuff you're comfortable discussing, especially the scientific things on there, because they could be a part of your interview. And also keep in mind for stuff like any books you mention, try and avoid those books being too long. Because if you imagine before your interview, trying to read through them again, trying to stay up to date, that can be difficult. So only mention things that are maybe easy to revise, stuff that you enjoy, stuff that you're genuinely passionate discussing. Because this is your opportunity to guide the interview in the way that you want it to go. And so that's what I would see the personal statement as, and not really much more than that. So the other thing that I think a lot of people ask about, that's a little separate to this. So one is, what kind of volunteering and work experience did I need for Oxford? What volunteering and work experience got me into Oxford? Completely missing the point, I would say. There is no volunteering and work experience that is going to get you into Oxford. You get into Oxford through UCAT GCSE interview. You get into Cambridge through UCAT GCSE with a bigger rating on the interview. The personal statement and your volunteering is not what's going to get you there. So it's not that you need any specific sorts of volunteering. You do need to be able to reflect on your experiences, and you do need to be able to have a reasonable understanding of maybe what the job of a doctor is like. But even in that context, I would say, because of the way the Oxford and Cambridge interviews are structured, you're probably going to have less opportunities to talk about that kind of stuff relative to, at say, an MMI medical school. So it's not that you necessarily absolutely need anything. Having some basic volunteering would be advisable for any medical school, and occasionally you will have the chance to bring it up. Having work experience, it really doesn't matter what you do. It's just that you find areas of medicine that interest you, that you can then read about more. And that brings me nicely to this idea of supercurriculars, when people feel that they need extracurriculars or they need supercurriculars. What I mean by that is just seeing something in a book, seeing something on your work experience, seeing something on your volunteering, finding an area of that you enjoy, and then maybe identifying a specific question. So if you say read a book about Parkinson's disease, and you then end up with a specific question, so for example, you've heard about this new therapy they do, deep brain stimulation, and you're wondering, could deep brain stimulation be a good therapy for Parkinson's disease? I then recommend maybe you read about it, you watch some podcasts, find that this is your area of interest, and maybe write an essay about it. So find some sources, write a couple 1,000 words or so, and talk about that area of research, talk about that thing that interests you, and then that gives you a really nice thing to put on your personal statement, a really nice passion project that you can then talk about at interview. So that's all that we mean by supercurriculars. It's not that you have to discover something new. It's not that you need to go into some very prestigious lab. All it means is you see something that interests you in a book, you develop that interest further, and it's now something that maybe you could talk about at the start of your interview when they're related back to your personal statement. So that's what you need in terms of supercurriculars. It doesn't really matter what you have, it's just something that you're passionate about, something that you've been able to explore further, maybe write a bit about. And you can even try and enter it to some essay competitions. If you win, you write about it as a prize-winning essay. If you don't win, you call it an independent research project. It doesn't really matter, it's just about how you discuss it. And you can do that with an EPQ if you want to, but for Oxford and Cambridge, I would be very mindful that the EPQ will not add any additional value over doing the same research independently and being able to reflect on it. And so I would only do something like that if you want to do it, as there is the potential that kind of a lot of the other aspects of it, like logbooks, planning and so on, could be a distraction. So overall, top tips are, biggest factor to start with at this stage is UCAT. So at this stage of year 12, if you're a year 12 watching this, emphasize the UCAT, emphasize getting the right predictions. Once you get to September and the UCAT is done, you've got plenty of time until December to read about lots of medicine, read ahead in your A-levels, that's going to help you with your A-level bio too, and just practice talking about science out loud. And that would be my main message. At this stage, maybe 1 or 2 supercurriculars, 1 or 2 books that interest you, but again, that's only going to be maybe a small part of your interview. So definitely think about it as UCAT important, supercurriculars nice to do, but secondary, and interviews important. So see it like that.
Okay, so the final part of the process, and arguably the most important part, is the interview itself. So Oxford and Cambridge both do interviews, very different to normal interviews. So normal interviews tend to be MMI, they tend to be panel-based, whereas Oxbridge interviews are a lot more scientific. So my 3 questions for you are, firstly, what is an Oxbridge medicine interview like? Secondly, What does it take to succeed in an Oxbridge medical interview? And finally, how should you prepare for an Oxbridge medical interview?
Thank you so much. So for your Oxbridge medical interviews, what you'll find, and if you do watch the other video we have out a couple of days earlier or alongside this, when we talked about MMIs, we covered the standard sorts of questions to expect. So you've got your personal qualities, motivations for medicine, ethics, hot topics, role plays, communication skills, situational judgment. These are only usually a small part of your Oxbridge medical interviews. Now, I would still prepare for them. They do occasionally come up, and they are usually maybe a small part of your interview, especially the ethical debates. A lot of your medical doctor interviews do like the ethical debates. But the biggest part of your interview is likely to have a more scientific focus at both Oxford and Cambridge. Now, at Cambridge, they can be more inclined to ask a little bit more about the physics side as well. So, especially in the context of medicine, if that's, say, something like action potentials in neurons, or if that's something like the cardiovascular system and pressure, that sort of thing. But across both of them, besides that little bit of extra physics, both of them, the main focus is all about the human body and generally the sort of human biology stuff that you find in your A-level studies, but a little bit beyond that. So it's all about applying your A-level knowledge and primarily your human biology knowledge, although bits of chemistry and more so physics at Cambridge, primarily your A-level biology knowledge and applying it to unfamiliar scenarios. So if you imagine doing your A-level biology exams and seeing application questions, it's just like that, but done out loud. So the majority of your questions are going to be on those sorts of lines. They'll give you a scenario, they'll expect you to reason your way through it. And your opportunity here is not to know the right answer. They're not expecting you to have that background knowledge, that background understanding. They're expecting you to show your ability to come up with plausible ideas and kind of defend those ideas and equally be willing to change those ideas when faced with new or alternative information. Now, the best way that you can prepare for something like this is, number one, practicing talking about science in unfamiliar contexts, practice talking about things that you don't know about and coming up with those ideas. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's extremely difficult to come up with ideas if you don't have that background knowledge. It's like imagining doing an A-level exam and trying an application question when you don't have the biology basics. So what I would also recommend is read ahead in your A-level biology syllabus, and you're going to need it anyway. Your Oxbridge interviews are in December, your A-levels are a couple months later. So read ahead in your A-level biology, any human topics, and have that basic idea. So all the different organ systems, a little bit of genetics, know where you can apply it, and practice talking about it. You don't need to know it in depth, but you definitely need to have an overview understanding of the major organ systems of the body and kind of anything you're likely to find in your A-level biology syllabus. Now, the other thing is that kind of the UK exam boards can be a bit different. So AQA and OCRA being the main ones. So you might want to take a look if there are any organ systems that maybe your exam board has missed. And then you can practice, once you finish your exam board, reading a little bit more about kind of other organ systems, the rest of the human body. And that would definitely be my advice for international students where to start. Look at the human biology content the UK exam boards do cover. So that will generally cover most of your application sorts of questions about the human body. You've also got occasionally some questions about interpreting research papers, and particularly maybe interpreting diagrams in those research papers. And you might be sent something like this, a full paper just before your interview. You might instead be maybe sent something or just to read during your interview, and it's a diagram. So for something like this, it's really important to practice reading things in the media, reading the news, even maybe trying to occasionally interpret some diagrams in research papers, and just getting the hang of maybe what they look like and going through them in a systematic way. So starting by describing what's on each axis, coming up with theories, what's going on, doing that in a systematic approach is exactly what they're looking for. So practice interpreting the data, practice research papers. And so these are definitely things that you can predict. I know like it could be said that that's chance, but equally kind of staying up to date with what's going on can improve your chances, or more generally just develop that skill of kind of interpreting, practicing research papers. So read ahead in your A-level biology, number 1. Practice reading maybe different research diagrams, research papers, also like the diagrams in textbooks, things like the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve from your A-level studies, being able to explain stuff like that. That would be step 1 and 2. Step 3, a little bit about how experiments are designed. Sometimes you get questions that ask you, like, how would you design an experiment to test so-and-so drug? And so knowing about things like randomization, double blinding, placebo controls, all the stuff about how an experiment is designed. And what I would really recommend is there's this nice book called Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. And I can also send the link for that. You can probably find that online. And that would also be a good one to read about experimental design. And that's actually one of the books you'll find on the Oxford Medicine reading list. So Oxford Medicine actually has a reading list of some different books that maybe are of interest to you. You don't need to read all of them. But once you've covered the basics from your A-level studies and also the basics of experimental design and kind of stuff like interpreting data, that would probably be the next place to go. Just starting to read about areas of medicine that interest you, trying to read broadly, having a broad understanding of stuff that you can apply, and some of the books there might be a good place to start. Equally, things like podcasts, YouTube, just as good, can also help to develop your knowledge. And I know there's a website called Teach Me Physiology that I think is quite good for that sort of thing in an approachable context. If you do really want to boost your chances of kind of knowing you have something to say and always having ideas, it might be a good idea to spend maybe like 5 minutes a night from September reading this book called the Oxford Handbook of Preclinical Medicine. Now, like, this is not essential, it's not something you have to do, but if you spend like a couple minutes, 4 or 5 minutes reading about medicine from there, that generally covers like lots of things from the first and second year medicine curriculum, and that's the kind of stuff that your tutors might be inclined to ask you about. And if you just have some of the basic knowledge from there, especially about the organ systems, again, that might help you to come up with ideas. But don't approach the interview thinking you need to know everything. You don't. Remember that you're only competing against other year 13s. So if you imagine that everyone has a baseline of 0, and they're asking you questions about stuff that happens in med school that no one knows about, if you can go up from this baseline of 0 a little bit here, and so you still don't know most of what they ask, but if you're a little bit here, that helps you to come up with ideas, and that helps you to reason and think. And I think it's a lot easier to reason and think when you have that broad background knowledge. So read as widely as you can would definitely be my recommendation. And then as you get closer to your interview, it might be a good idea to look up your interviewers, because occasionally they do ask questions that are perhaps more inclined to their subject area. Now, it's probably not going to be their specific field of research, but it might be more broader in terms of what they do. If you find that, say, one of your interviewers teaches physiology, all about organ systems, at the university, then maybe they're more likely to ask about organ systems than, say, the bones of the body, which would be anatomy. Equally, if you've got someone who is a respiratory physician and they always focus on the lungs and imaging of the lungs, then maybe they're not going to ask just about the lungs, but they're probably going to ask about maybe like cardiovascular system, lungs, imaging, MRI, CT, X-ray, that sort of thing. So you can try and come up with ideas, like if someone works with imaging and they teach imaging, maybe they're going to ask you about those sorts of things. And again, I remember that for one of my interviews that was quite useful, and so I would recommend going on those sorts of lines too. I think that pretty much covers most of it, and I guess generally speaking, know a little bit about kind of different forms of medical imaging, X-ray, CT, MRI could be quite helpful. But I think that would come under your reading widely, reading broadly. So main thing is just practice talking out loud, practice sharing your thoughts, read broadly if you can to help you come up with ideas. But again, if you don't know, then don't worry. It's just about thinking on the spot. They are looking to put you on the spot and see how you deal with it, what you can say. Don't be quiet. Keep talking, keep sharing what you think, and you'll be good. And practice can definitely be helpful. A lot of people find that something like mock interviews can help. But if you don't have the option to do that, it can be equally useful to do things even with someone non-medical, with friends at school, with teachers, with parents, as the main thing is just you practicing sharing your thoughts, not necessarily always has to be that someone that you're doing it with is a doctor or a med student. But yeah, lots of practice, lots of reading would be the way to go.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I think that covers basically everything when it comes to the Oxbridge medical process. There's so much stuff involved, but hopefully this information has been really useful. I think particularly the interview information was extremely useful. We've covered absolutely everything. Literally everything. So much has been covered. So much useful information, and hopefully nothing's been missed. But if you do have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section below. I'm sure Ojas will be very much inclined to answer. I guess some final remarks from Ojas before we end off the video.
Nothing really to add, but very, very best of luck. It is achievable. I know I've listed a lot of things, and the reason why I listed these things in kind of levels, which is like you have to read ahead in your A-level biology, you probably want to know a bit about experimental design. You can do some reading of this Oxford Handbook of Preclinical Medicine. I phrased it like that because kind of these are stages of what you have to do. And even if you don't do the bare minimum and you only know a little bit of your A-level biology, there's still probably quite a good chance that you'll have things to talk about and come up with ideas for the interview questions. So this is a suggestion of what kind of you absolutely, if you really want to try and you want to maximize your chances, these are the things you can do. But even if you do maybe like half of these things, your chances will still be quite reasonable, provided UCAT GCSEs are there. It is quite an achievable process. It's not kind of impossibly difficult. And so my main message would be, don't let the number of things I've mentioned here put you off. These are just kind of a series of steps that you can go through. Provided you've got here, you're thinking about medicine, you're thinking about Oxford, you probably do have it in you. And I would be confident that you can do it. I would apply. And I hope to see as many of you as possible starting at Oxford and Cambridge soon. And naturally, Oxford is better, but
thank you very much. That's a wrap.